1, beef up your mix. Most sample libraries tend to be weakest in the upper registers. East-West, in particular, has that problem, so tweak your samples to cut out the frequencies that sound particularly bad. Also, to get that rich, cinematic sound, don't be afraid to use slight compression and EQ on the final output. It's better not to leave the samples completely dry. Number 2, use reverb. Reverb can be your biggest enemy when it comes to achieving realism, but it can also be your best friend. When using reverb, it's better to use high-quality convolution reverb than simple reverb programs. East-West samples come with such reverb built in, but I'm not the biggest fan of the reverb patches. When it comes to reverb, don't use too much and don't use too little. Find the right balance by listening to the mix on as many different speaker sets as possible. Number 3, use filler instruments. In the case of some compositions, all it takes is adding one more instrument to create a more realistic, full sound by adding depth and emotion to your piece. Listen to the demo with and without the dulcimer. Number 4, use flare articulations. I call the pre-recorded fancy articulation flare articulations. They are the type of articulations you just can't perform on a MIDI keyboard, so they had musicians record it live. Since they are authentic performances of the articulation, they are essentially real. Use them every now and then to fool the listeners into forgetting about the fact they are listening to samples. Now, I say this with caution. Don't overuse them or they will lose their potency. Number 5, find the good registers. Each sampled patch has a certain pitch range that sounds more realistic than the rest. The Goliath orchestral strings are a good example. The low ends and the high ends sound pretty good. The middle section begins to lose its delicacy when the violas and the cellos overlap. So for the sake of realism, try and avoid these areas. Number 6, automation, velocities, etc. This may seem obvious, but it's worth expounding on. Most host programs will allow for nearly any amount of automation. When a patch becomes too complicated to perform volumes and velocities in real time, automation is a handy way to make your computerized performances sound more organic. Number 7, find a favorite instrument. So find an instrument you're comfortable with and you enjoy, and learn to play it on your MIDI keyboard and practice it almost like you would a real instrument. It may sound kind of weird, but it really does help to become comfortable with a patch before you record a part. The more human elements you can add to it while you lay down the tracks in MIDI, the better. Also listen to recordings of the instrument you like and make sure you know the range, timbre, and general capabilities of the instrument before you start to lay down tracks. Nothing screams MIDI samples like an impossibly hard French horn part. Also, compositionally speaking, using a specific instrument throughout a piece and somewhat regularly can add to the continuity of a piece. If you are doing film or media scoring, it's perfectly fine to maintain a similar sound throughout a composition. Number 8, don't exceed library capabilities. This is the most important thing to keep in mind as you score for MIDI. Basically, if you don't own Hollywood Strings or a similar high-end sample library, don't act like it. Find the patches that sound realistic and stick to them. There is no way you can substitute your samples for a real orchestra, and sometimes trying to orchestrate like John Williams or another such composer will only make your samples sound obscenely fake. If a patch says legato in its title, don't think that it actually sounds good as legato. I can't tell you how many times I scan through a sample list and completely ignore the titles, go by sound, not description. And for anyone who says to me, well, I don't want to sacrifice music quality for MIDI realism, then I say, fine. Then write an orchestration and record it with live musicians if you can afford it. But don't make your audience sit in their seats at the movie theater or wherever else your music is being performed, writhing around because everything sounds so ridiculously synthesized. I feel it's better to make things sound real than making them musically complex. The fact that you're using samples anyways probably says something about our musical levels, at least at this point in time. We will all hopefully graduate from these samples to the real thing one day. In the meantime, I hope all these tips help. Happy sequencing, YouTube.